Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So welcome to our webinar, The Page Act of 1875, Rethinking Its Significance 150 Years Later. This event is co-sponsored by the Immigration History Research Center and the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. My name is Hidetaka Hirota. I am the Vice President of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Um, Before we start this event, I would like to thank the Immigration History Research Center, especially Dr. Michelle Weslin, the Assistant Director of the Center, for supporting this event by providing all the necessary logistics. So this year, 2025, marks the 150th anniversary of the Page Act of 1875. The law was passed in the midst of growing anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States. It criminalized the importation to the United States of women for the purposes of prostitution, banning the admission of such women as well as convicted criminals. The law also prohibited Americans from importing to the United States forcibly recruited contract workers from, quote, China, Japan, or an Oriental country, making the violation of provision a criminal offense. So the act was one of the first national immigration laws that developed in the late 19th century, and especially it is very important for its target at the Chinese women. But this act also had a really important, profound implications for the discourse on gender, sexuality, and morality in the United States in subsequent periods. So this event will use this anniversary as an opportunity to think about the significance of the Page Act in U.S. historiography, based on the conversation among specialists in immigration history, Asian American history, and women's and gender history. I'm honored to introduce the moderator of the event, Professor Naoko Wake. She is a professor of history at Michigan State University. She is a historian of race, gender, sexuality, and illness in the 20th century United States and Pacific Rim. She is the author of Private Practices, Harry Stark Salvin, Science of Homosexuality and American Liberalism, and American Survivors, Trans-Pacific Memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She has also co-edited a book, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Beyond the Ocean. And most recently, she edited a special issue on Asian American disability in the Journal of American Ethnic History. We're so fortunate to have her as the moderator of the event. Thank you, Naoko, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hide, and good afternoon, everybody tuning into this event through webinar. It's great to have you here. Before I introduce our fantastic 4 panelists tonight, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. So this webinar is being recorded, and the question and answer portion will happen in the Q&A function. So you can submit questions at any time during the presentation. We will turn to audience questions at the end of the program. I'm hoping that we will have about 20 minutes for that. And you can choose to submit questions anonymously if you don't want your name to be mentioned when the question is posted. So it's my great pleasure to introduce 4 presenters that are participating in a panel tonight. Beth Lou Williams is Professor of History and Director of the program in Asian American Studies at Princeton University. She's the author of The Chinese Must Go, Violence, Exclusion, and the Making of the Alien in America from Harvard University Press in 2018, and the forthcoming John Doe Chinaman, A Forgotten History of Chinese Life Under American Racial Law from Harvard University, upcoming in 2025 this year. Eva Payne is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Mississippi. She is the author of Empire of Purity, The History of America's Global War on Prostitution from Princeton University Press in 2024. Her writing has also appeared in publications, including the Journal of Women's History and Radical History Review. Charlotte Brooks is Professor of History at Baruch College, CUNY, and the CUNY Graduate Center. Her newest book is the forthcoming The Mois of New York and Shanghai, A Chinese-American Family in War and Revolution from University of California Press. the story of 6 extraordinary Chinese American siblings and their spouses during the exclusion era. She is also the author of 3 other books, American Exodus, Second Generation Chinese Americans in China from 1901 to 1949, Between Mao and McCarthy, Chinese American Politics in the Cold War Years, and Alien Neighbors, Foreign Friends, Asian Americans, Housing, and the Transformation of Urban California. Hardeep Dhillon is Assistant Professor in Asian American History and core faculty in the Asian American Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Dhillon's research focuses on the history of immigration to the United States and the laws and legal practices that shape immigrants' lives. Professor Dhillon's current book project, tentatively titled America's Modern Immigrant Family, studies the legal construction of the modern immigrant family through the lens of Asian American history. Her writing can be also found in Law and History Review, Smithsonian Magazine, and the Caravan. So I like to start with the first question. We have 3 questions that we prepared for tonight's discussion. And then again, there will be a time for Q&As with the audience. So my first question is this. Would you be willing to tell us how your previous or current research intersected with the Page Act of 1874 or its legacies? So Beth, if you are willing to start, that would be wonderful.
Yes, I'm happy to start. I'm glad to be here and speaking with these amazing colleagues. I guess I wanted to start before I answer your question about my current research and its relationship to the Page Act. I just want to acknowledge that it's a really upsetting time, I think, for anyone interested in U.S. immigration law. And you know, it feels like a heavy moment as we have a lot of people that are feeling the force of U.S. immigration law right now. So yes, I want to talk about my work in relation to the Page Act. And it's one thing that I want to do is to sort of put to the side the law itself. And so maybe I'm not the ideal person to go first, I'm realizing. So I think that the Page Act has had a lot of attention, perhaps not as much as the Chinese exclusion laws, but it has had attention because it is a federal law that regulated, as you just heard, Chinese women who were supposedly imported for prostitution, contract workers who are referred to as coolies, and also criminals from other countries. But I think that the focus on federal law has meant that we've spent less time talking about the regulation of some of these same categories in state and local law. And so what I'm working on right now with my forthcoming book that's coming out in September is to try to think again about local and state regulation. Because if we look at these categories of people targeted in federal law, it's certainly an important thing, you know, that the effects on who can come into the country and that border crossing experience and who is deportable once within the country. But as far as the sort of everyday experience of immigrants interacting with state power, with the government interfering in their lives, I think that local and state law is something that U.S. immigration historians, at least, have not paid enough attention to. So, for example, with the Page Act, the Page Act is based on 2 California laws that were passed at the same time in 1870, known as the Coolie Act and the Kidnapping Act. These 2 laws regulated contract workers, Chinese contract workers, and then Chinese women imagined to be imported for prostitution. You know, later, these laws are really revisions of them, later instantiations of them were ruled unconstitutional because it was ruled that the federal government, not the state, had control over immigration law. But I think that, that's the normal story that we tell. We sort of say, okay, it starts at the states, it moves to federal, and then the story continues. But I think that that story leaves out the fact that local and state laws continue to regulate Chinese immigrants, even in realms other than immigration. So, for example, there are also state and local laws that regulated Chinese prostitutes or Chinese sex workers starting as early as the 1860s. There was a law in San Francisco and then a law in California, sort of statewide, that named Chinese women as the subject of these laws. And then even when those laws, sort of racially explicit laws, were replaced by race-neutral alternatives, through discretionary policing, police were able to continue to target Chinese women in particular. And I tell this story in part because I think that, in my own work, but I think also more generally, we need to think more broadly about sort of if we look from the perspective of the lives of immigrants as opposed to the perspective of the state, we see a more complicated terrain that they're attempting to navigate. So if we think about it, for example, from the perspective of Chinese women, yes, they faced immigration control at US borders, but then also they faced policing in their everyday lives, disproportionate arrest for, infractions such as prostitution. And so that's sort of how my work is currently intersecting with the Page Act.
I will go next. So for my research, really kind of related to what Beth said, what's really important is the way it targeted prostitution. And that's not to say that its focus on Asian people isn't important. It's actually crucial because it links the idea of foreignness and deviant sexuality in law. And this has really lasting consequences, both for immigration law, but also more broadly for laws and federal laws eventually targeting commercial sex. So my book, I'm shameless, I'm gonna plug it. I'm still very proud of it. Shows how this initial kind of federal interest in prostitution really does snowball to help allow for much broader policing of women and offers new ways to surveil them. It really gives the federal government a new tool to target all women when it wants to. So I situate the Page Act certainly within growing anti-Chinese sentiment in the late 19th century, but also within this growing transatlantic movement at the same time that's really concerned with prostitution specifically and about how states should make laws and regulations about it. So as Americans are growing increasingly worried about this idea that prostitution is a really serious threat to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these subsequent immigration acts build on the Page Act, and they really elaborate on the kind of categories of sexually immoral women who are targeted. So the 1903 Immigration Act excluded all prostitutes. The 1907 Immigration Act expanded this to exclude people suspected of a really broad range of sort of prostitution-related offenses. So women and girls entering the country for any other immoral purpose aside from prostitution, right? That's hugely broad. Anyone who imported women, jail time and fines, along with deportation of anyone who harbored an alien prostitute within 3 years of her entry into the United States, or anyone who worked in a brothel. If you're a maid in a brothel, you're deportable. And significantly, this 1910 act mandates the deportation of any woman who practices prostitution within 3 years of entering. Or sorry, the 1907 Act does this. Anyway, after some big legal challenges, Congress passes the Immigration Act of 1910, which allows for the deportation of any alien woman who practices prostitution at any time after their entry, no matter how long they had been in the country. And for Asian women who couldn't be naturalized, right, they were always at risk. And this is a really key moment because it means that immigration officials, local police, social reformers really can scrutinize and punish immigrants for their post-entry behavior, their post-entry sexual behavior. And this is actually really striking because in 1910, prostitution in most jurisdiction, right, the exact exchange of sex for money itself is not a criminal act. There's everything around it is often criminalized, but that act itself is not technically a crime. That doesn't really happen most places until World War I. But I see this focus on prostitution and this elaboration on prostitution in immigration law, right, which starts with the Page Act, as very much closely tied to the kind of eventual criminalization of prostitution in various ways in federal, state, and municipal laws, and really how it plays out as a focus on controlling women and their bodies. It really helps build government capacity to kind of enact a new level of surveillance on immigrant women and their sexuality, which, as I show in my book, really helps to justify the surveillance of all women's sexual behavior eventually as a matter of national security, right? A means of protecting the United States.
So I think I'll go next. Unsurprisingly, I guess I'm going to take a more transnational approach to the impact of the Page Law. It caused a very real drop in the already small number of Chinese women emigrating. It didn't really impact the number of men emigrating, but there weren't many women coming anyway relative to male immigration from China, and that number dropped. And this meant, in larger ways, that a sizable second Chinese American generation didn't emerge until the 1920s. While even Chinese American men in the citizen men in the 19th and early 20th century tended to marry women in China, women who faced tremendous difficulty entering the United States. So the Page Act helped set in motion these forces that deeply shaped the development of communities on both sides of the Pacific. In Guangdong's Pearl River Delta, this meant villages that consisted mainly of women, children, and the elderly, while in the US, it meant a noticeable sex imbalance in Chinese American communities. And of course, this imbalance not only fuels greater suspicion about Chinese sexuality, but as I've talked about in one of my books, it also shaped the trajectory of Chinese American politics and interactions with the emerging welfare state by the 1930s, all the way into the 40s and 50s. Even among Chinese American citizens, when that second generation formed, politics in major Chinese American communities developed as especially China-focused and even more heavily male than in other US communities, which is a trend that took decades to undo. More recently, I've written about Chinese American emigration to China from the turn of the century to World War II, about Chinese American citizens born on US soil, lacking educational or career opportunities, actually emigrating to China. This is actually the subject of my forthcoming book too. And these things reflect other legacies of the Page Act. By the late 1910s and 1920s, there were actually a lot of China-born people who began to come in significant numbers to the United States to study in American colleges and universities. Most of these students were men, and a surprising number actually married Chinese American citizen women, eventually taking them back to China. And as many here know, there was a 1907 law that declared that women of any race who married foreign citizen men lost their US citizenship. But in 1922, after women won the right to vote, Congress passed this thing called the Cable Act, which repealed large parts of the 1907 law. Now women had independent nationality, except of course for one group, women who married aliens ineligible for citizenship, meaning Asian immigrants. And once women who married ineligible aliens lost their own citizenship, they could not get it back if they too were members of races, in other words, Asians, whom Congress and the courts had declared ineligible to naturalize. And what's interesting is that according to contemporary observers, legislators wrote the Cable Act this way, not to punish Asian American women, whom they didn't even consider. That's not really particularly shocking. But instead, as a suffragist named Emma Wald noted soon after the Cable Act's passage, it, quote, seemed originally intended to penalize a marriage of an American woman of the Caucasian race with Asiatics, unquote. And that's her language at the time. So the supposed sexual and moral threat that Chinese posed to white Americans, that was the supposed threat that led to the Page Act in the first place, was still there in the minds of white lawmakers in 1922. Now, Congress eventually repealed this part of the Cable Act in 1931, which meant that Asian American women no longer lost their citizenship if they married an Asian immigrant man. But Congress did this in part because advocates for this change suggested that repealing this part of the Cable Act would discourage possible interracial marriage, this time between Asian women and white men. Now, long after its marriage, and even after its 1931 alteration, long after its passage, the Cable Act had devastating consequences for Chinese American women who had married China-born men and then gone to China with them. This is what I found in my last two books, that if these marriages failed, as sometimes happened, the women in question could not easily return to the United States because of visa requirements and bond requirements. They often didn't have money or the ability to sustain themselves outside of marriage. And even if they did have the money to return, they could not do so permanently, but only temporarily. So they were forever cut off from their families in the United States. Now, after the 1931 change to the law, Asian American women who wanted to get their citizenship back could do so, but only by returning to US soil and starting the naturalization process there. This is a far higher bar than non-Asian women had faced after the Cable Act allowed them to resume their US citizenship. Many Chinese American women didn't have the money to return to the US, and even those who did or who married after 1931 could not pass their citizenship on to their children born in China until another legal change in 1934. The law was not retroactive, so they couldn't give their children the protection of US citizenship. And what this actually meant was that many of these women and their children were trapped in China when the Japanese invaded, and the US government did not offer them that kind of help that it gave to white Americans to get out, both in 1937 and in 1940. And some of them died. Far more suffered terribly, were on the brink of starvation, separated from families during the 8-year conflict that follows. This had a terrible impact long past the Page Act, that set into motion these different forces that you can still see in the 40s.
Hi, I also want to begin by by thanking folks for being both a part of the audience today, but also to my colleagues who, one, helped put this event together, but are actually in conversation with me today as well. I also do want to echo Professor Lou Williams's point about the moment that we're in, not just in relationship to the impact on immigrant communities and questions of due process and judicial review that we're witnessing in the national climate, but also the real kind of conundrum that the discipline of history is facing under the current administration as well. I also feel like Professor Lou Williams that the Page Act is a part of my work, but not necessarily at the center. And perhaps the way I'll talk about it is how it can be instructive for many scholars. I found the Page Act to be constructive or instructive in two particular ways. One is a larger emphasis on the Page Act has redefined the chronology of the way in which we talk about restrictive federal immigration law. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 continues to be the primary federal law that immigration scholars point to, including scholars who focus specifically on Asian American history, but I think even more so in fields outside of Asian American history. And the Page Act reminds us that it's not just a question of race and labor in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that was central to restriction and exclusion, but gender and sexuality as key analytical categories as well. And it actually pushes us to expand what we talk about when we're talking about labor as well, introducing core concepts like contract labor and gendered economic labor as well, and questions about the formal and informal economy. The second way I find it quite instructive is to make us think about folks who weren't the majority of immigrants that were traveling to the United States at this time, but that were still placed under restrictive federal and state laws. For me, the Page Act compels us to think about the place of women, but beyond thinking about the place of women, it really compels us to think about gender and sexuality as key analytical categories. And I think Dr. Payne really alluded to the way in which you can do that, but also Dr. Brooks, the way it's not just about women and their sexuality, but core concepts like the family that are really critical to this as well. And not just a family that lives in the United States, but the transnational family as well. And the way that this plays out in my own work is thinking about the way in which key concepts like gender and sexuality are not just significant at the border, but under state and local law as well. So I'm going to bring us a bit full circle and think about the comments that Professor Lou Williams made about local and state law. For me, the PAGE Act reminds us to think about Chinese immigrant women and women more generally in relationship to the social lives that they had, the social, political, economic lives that they had beyond the point of entry. And in the United States, these are women who had families and kinship networks and economic networks of various sorts, and they were women that had families. So thinking about the place of women has also led me to think about the place of children, which is another core gender it's a core analytical category within the field of gender studies. And it's by thinking about women in relationship to families that I've been thinking about the mixed status family and the role that local and state law has played in relationship to the mixed status family in the United States. Particularly, I've been thinking more and more about the role that Asian American women have played in what some might classify as early civil rights organizing in a very capacious sense. This isn't a transracial civil rights organizing. It might just be limited to a particular community. And I think about the history of education in this way. So I've been thinking about the way in which, in addition to women and male laborers, children have been excluded under state and federal law prior to and at the same moment as the PAGE Act. So children who were coming to the United States as immigrants, but also children of Chinese ancestry who were born in the United States were actually excluded in 1870 from public education in the state of California. And so the question of exclusion wasn't necessarily about segregation, as you see with other kinds of communities, particularly African Americans in the United States, are about boarding schools and indigenous communities, but it was the outright denial of a right to a public education in a public schoolhouse. And this is where I say that the PAGE Act is instructive. It makes us think about people who we haven't seen before 1882 and even after. It makes us think about the way in which gender can be an incredibly useful category of analysis beyond the scope of women and sexuality, and really make us think about what happened prior to 1882 with different kinds of communities who were moving into the United States. And this includes the family and children.
Thank you so much. This is so informative. Let me ask the second question that we prepared for you. So that is, what are some of the most exciting trends you can identify in the study of race, gender, and labor, or topics related to the PAGE Act in your field or fields?
Okay, I think I'm up first again. Oh, I can think of a lot. It's hard to pick, right? I think so. The PAGE Act, again, I think if we take the three different targets of the PAGE Act, it would spin out different, trends and topics that certainly need more research. And that's really the way that I thought about answering this question is, if I were to send a student out to do more research, what would I want them to do? I think the section that focuses on contract labor or coolies really asks us to do, I know Hidetaka Hirota is doing some of this work, do more work and attention to the focus on contract labor and regulating contract labor through immigration law. I think that the section that focuses on immigrants as criminals is very interesting as well. And it suggests that there's a sort of an early association of criminality with immigrants all the way back to this 1875 federal immigration law. I think a lot of the research that we've seen so far talking about the criminalization of immigrants and also the overlap between sort of policing and immigration control is mostly 20th century, but I think this law invites scholars to think about earlier histories there. On the topic of women, again, Chinese women suspected of prostitution, I think actually, and this is some of the work that I'm working on, and also one of my students has done amazing work on. His name is Alex Jin. I think that this, and this is tricky, that the law also invites us to take seriously the social history of Chinese sex work and the trafficking of Chinese women. And this one's tricky, I think, because as we know, and as some of as our panelists have already pointed out, the Page Act, it really it helped to cement a stereotype of Chinese women as sort of hypersexualized, as lewd, as prostitutes, and these are really damaging stereotypes that had effects in law, but also more broadly in American culture. I think for that reason, historians have been wary about talking about the very real social conditions of Chinese sex work in the West. And so the result has been sort of a hole in the scholarship that non-professionally trained historians have sought to fill, right? So instead of historians really going after and talking about this and attempting to do what would be very complicated research about Chinese women's lives, instead we have journalists, most recently Julia Flynn Siller, who has been writing about this. There's one book that's by a historian, Benson Tong, but it was has been it's a discredited history. And then there's one sociology article that I see everyone citing on this. It's by Lucy Chang Harada, but it's from the 1970s. I think that there's a lot of space here to go back and try to tell an important social history about Chinese women and prostitution, which would combine, these topics of labor, gender, race, and sexuality.
I hope your student publishes this work. This is so exciting. So I'm going to focus, again, there's so many things to talk about, but I'm going to kind of focus, I think, on the relationship between the kind of Page Act as this foundational moment in restricting the immigration of women who are supposedly sexually immoral, and the relationship of that to U.S. imperialism, because it's an avenue I pursue in my work and that I'm seeing other people doing really fascinating work. And I see this work kind of taking two forms. So first, I'm really interested in how immigration restrictions have been deployed and operated outside the borders of the mainland United States as a way of sort of expanding both the kind of real political borders, but also the kind of moral borders of the United States. So in my book, for example, I look at how the exclusion and deportation of women whom officials label as prostitutes actually is an important way that US officials in colonies can control women and their labor, but then also justify what they're doing as a kind of civilizing, modernizing project. So just one example, in the early 20th century in the Panama Canal Zone, US immigration officials sort of they decide that the 1910 law applies in the Canal Zone, and they deploy these kind of anti-prostitution provisions to deport and exclude specifically Black Jamaican women from the Canal Zone, during the time they're trying to kind of make the Canal Zone into again, kind of quote unquote, white civilized settler colony in the tropics. Now, of course, this is even as Canal Zone officials really wanted women, though not necessarily Black West Indian women, to be selling sex. They just wanted them to do it over the borders in the Republic of Panama, right? Not in the Canal Zone. So I think these avenues of inquiry, thinking about how these laws get deployed in colonies, really raises these really interesting questions about migration, sexuality, citizenship, and race that are really important to both immigration historians and historians of US empire. And that's the literature that I'm a little more familiar with. So recent books by people like Tessa Winkleman, Justin Jackson on the Philippines touch on this. Joanne Flores Villalobos's book on the Panama Canal Zone does some of this work. And I think it's a really exciting avenue. And the other kind of intersection I wanted to touch on of US empire and immigration law is about the kind of exportation of American style anti-prostitution immigration laws around the world. So not just to colonies, but to sovereign countries. And in my work, I really see this happening in the 1920s and 30s, where Americans play this critical role in shaping anti-trafficking discourse in the international community, and specifically at the League of Nations, right, which is the kind of intergovernmental organization founded after World War II, or World War I. So Americans really push the exclusion and deportation of foreign prostitutes and the control of women at every kind of step of the migration process as a means of stopping the traffic in women and of ultimately protecting these women. Now, the kind of data American researchers collect suggests that the vast majority of these women who are migrating and selling sex in the interwar period are not being sort of forced into sex by some criminal syndicate, right, which is a popular narrative about trafficking. That is not to say they weren't coerced in all kinds of ways and aided by third parties and coerced by third parties. But really what I see time and time again is that women face these serious structural constraints that they reported. And that migrating and selling sex was the best economic option among a lot of very hard options. And in fact, in the League of Nations data, many women say that immigration restrictions that are supposed to sort of protect women, in fact, make their lives more precarious, make them have to pay more bribes. But Americans at the League of Nations sort of ignore this and really promote this idea that exclusion and deportation of prostitutes and harsh scrutiny of migrating women right at departure, during their journey, and at entry, that this is how you protect women. And this is how countries prove that they're modern, right? That they're fit to govern themselves. And so countries, League reports recommend these changes, and a lot of countries began to adopt them, right, as a means of starting trafficking. And I actually really see this to sort of wrap around to the Page Act again and kind of ideas about Asian immigration, right? Although it's an older work, Adam McEwen's Melancholy Order, again, thinks about how these Asian exclusion border control regimes have spread globally. And I think there's just a lot of room for work that examines how different kinds of immigration restriction regimes end up kind of spreading and changing and being deployed for to target specific people in specific contexts.
This is sort of a really, really interesting and difficult question, I think. I've been excited by comparative and transnational work, which places Asian American history in the transnational context in which it took place, but also a sort of a central way of looking at U.S. history. And I think somebody who does this well, especially the comparative part, is Tan Chu, who is now at Peking University, and he recently published this article in the Journal of Civil War History that looks at the local and state roots in California of the Page Act in a lot of ways, and discusses judges and immigration authorities and habeas and the way women use the courts as well. And I think I'm looking forward to he's got something else I believe in the pipeline. We kind of talked about it a while ago. that he's doing research on the way that Chinese American citizen men understood, described, and deployed masculinity, sometimes in really, really retrograde ways, to defend their prerogatives in the exclusion years, but also to sort of push back against ideas of Chinese sexuality in the Page Act. And like others who've gone spoken before me, I think the work that really shows how international exclusion was this international experience and practice in the late 19th and early 20th century is so valuable. You know, Adam McEwen's older work, yes, May Nai's Chinese Question, Elliot Young's book, there are other examples, but the way that these stereotypes of Chinese families, laborers, and the supposed threat that they pose to white nations and living standards, you know, was not unique to one country, but it was shared, especially the British Empire and the United States. And like Dr. Williams, I do think that there is such a need for historically rigorous studies of Chinese prostitution in the West. And I'm reminded over and over in doing research on other topics how difficult it is to do that research. And I'm just going to sort of finish with an example that in writing this most recent book that I'm finishing now, if done, will be out next year, and it's a story of 6 Chinese American siblings and their spouses. And one of the spouses, you know, it's kind of a family biography. I interviewed her granddaughter, and then I interviewed somebody else, and it started to dawn on me with the questions I was asking and the answers I got that nobody knew when she was born, but it became clear that it was sort of understood but not discussed that she had a white father. But she had all, her siblings were all Chinese American. They had a Chinese American father, Chinese American mother. And nobody spoke of it, but then people whispered about it. And I realized this mother had been sex trafficked as a young woman, probably 12 or 13-year-old, brought into the United States, eventually married in a common law way, perhaps, but I'm not really sure. Nobody really knows when the woman was born. And I imagine that there are a lot of such stories in families that don't get discussed or are buried or are just sort of explained away, which I think the word discussed was sort of tricky. It's a really difficult issue to do research on. And it just reminds me over how important it is, but how really difficult it is even to know where to start, what threads to pull, and how to follow these stories to their ends.
Thanks for the question. I'm actually really glad to go after all my co-panelists, because then I get to think with them, but I then also have to change all my responses in relationship to what they're saying. I think we've raised some significant points here. There's the question of how do you do a social history that tries to stay true to the experiences that people may have had in a moment in which the racialization and the sexualization of particular kinds of women and communities is very real. There's questions about methods there. There seems to be lots of questions about scale here, the scale of empire, and then tons of questions about the administrative state and law and how you write those histories. One of the areas in which it's an area that's influenced me for some time, is newer scholarship that really tries to place the history of Chinese restriction and exclusion, which includes the Page Act, within the history of the United States more widely, particularly within the history of Reconstruction. And often Chinese immigration history is discussed separately from that subfield of history. And there's been scholars who have pushed back on that, Professor Lou Williams here, but in recent years, well, her work is recent. In addition to her work, there's also, it's been referenced already, May Nai's latest work, The Cooley Question, which takes seriously the questions of scale that we've been asking here, but also takes us to the state level as well and pushes back the timeline into the mid-19th century for us, introduces new kinds of political actors. And then I'm also thinking about the work of Kevin Kenny, his latest book, but then also some work that's already been around by historians of California and the US West, folks like Michael Bottoms. And what I find very enriching about this work is that the history of Chinese immigration becomes not additive to the history of the United States that they're telling, but actually quite transformative, making us rethink very central questions of what was happening in relationship to race. So racial violence becomes not only a question of African-American communities contending with new racial dynamics in the US South or the North or even the Midwest or the US West, but it becomes a question of also Native communities and immigrant communities. And I don't think that there's a way you can really study that period without studying Chinese immigration history. But it's interesting that that field is often taught without Chinese immigration history to this day. And if there is a text that might be listed on kind of a history syllabus for even graduate students or undergrads, it's probably 1 or 2 texts at most. And I'll use the word instructive again to maybe think about why I find this work so compelling. I find it so compelling because I think it teaches us that there is really no way of doing US history without constellating questions of race across different kinds of communities and across different scales, which includes but is not limited to empire. And each of these historians that I've listed do that incredibly well, and make us rethink this very canonical historical moment, which some would consider the second founding of the United States. I do want to return also to this question of social history and the social history of women and the stickiness of that. I find women's history incredibly instructive because it compels historians to deal with very difficult questions related to the archive. And I think the question of Chinese immigrant women in the late 19th century is not exceptional to that. It's actually a part of it, which is what do you do with an archive that often depicts a particular set of women as hypersexualized, as hyper-racialized, and that is the primary archive that you have available. In this case, it might be immigration files that you find on the border, or files that criminalize some of these women within the contours of a local city or town or the state. And I do think that women's history has been incredibly helpful in this domain, making us think about what the archive tells us and what it doesn't. I'm thinking about historians that have approached this question very directly. Some of you are already on this call, but I'm also thinking about folks who have kind of taken the question dead on, scholars like Saidiya Hartman, but I'm also thinking about someone like Gayatri Bahadur, who, you know, when she can't ask a question of the archive or the kind of question she's interested in isn't answerable by the archive that she's looking at, she asks it very directly and leaves it in her writing so that her readers know that these are things that she is thinking about, but she doesn't have an answer to. And I think the moment that we've arrived in history has history as a discipline that is gives us much to think with and return to in the history of Chinese immigrant women, but also lots of other women and marginalized historical actors that require us to approach this history not from kind of traditional truth-seeking methods of the historical discipline, but through the messiness of what our discipline can and cannot offer.
Thank you so much. I love the way that, you know, each and everyone's comments are really generative and responding to each other. In my third question, which is hopefully really broadly applicable because it's a question related to teaching, please feel, you know, everybody to fold in your response to comments that are made by your panelists so far, because I think it'll be really nice to be able to see how each and everybody's comment is resonating each other. So my third question is, how do you teach the Page Act or issues related to the Page Act in the classroom? Do you link these issues to what's happening today? And if so, in what context do you make that connection? And what do you want your students to get from that?
So I thought I would answer this very literally. Like I just taught, or I'm one lecture away from finishing a survey in Asian American history. When did we teach the Page Act? So I taught the Page Act, I think it's the second week of classes, in the context of talking about sort of Chinese restriction, Chinese exclusion, the sort of road towards federal immigration law. I have my students read the Page Act alongside the 1882 law. And then I pair it with primary sources that are in the collection, Chinese American Voices, that it has multiple authors, but one of them is Gordon H. Chang. And in that source book, they have sort of multiple sources from the Chinese American community, both from the perspective of Chinese women. I think it's someone rescued by missionaries, but then also the Chinese six companies sort of making a stand against Chinese prostitution. So I find that this collection of both government sources and sort of community sources is really a powerful thing for my students. And then as I move through the semester, I try to bring back some of the themes of the Page Act. For example, when I'm talking about the sexualization and stereotyping of Chinese women, which, it sort of goes into the 20th and 21st centuries. When I'm talking about increasing fears of criminal aliens and criminalization, I also sort of dip back to the Page Act. And then as I try to, capture the lives of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in the United States. So again, that social history that's it's essential to what we do, but often difficult to research and difficult for the students to sort of fully grasp. One of the ways that I do that is to try to give them a layered sense of the sorts of state power that are interacting with Chinese women's lives. And so I talk about local, municipal, state, and federal laws, sort of, and how they inform Chinese immigrant women's experiences in the US.
I think for me, this question is sort of most interesting to think about in my big US history survey, which I teach every year. So I do talk about the Page Act, even though like the US history survey, you're just running the whole time. And I talk about it as a crucial moment in US immigration history, but then I use it as a way of drawing out these larger themes that I'm trying to get students to think about the whole time, and particularly the idea that racial categories in the United States are not stable. They are socially constructed, they change over time, and they're closely related to ideas about citizenship. So I'm at the University of Mississippi, and that really shapes my kind of context, right? It's a state where the broader public conversation about race tends to be shaped by a kind of black-white binary, which then tends to make racial categories just seem sort of like neutral, unchanging, inevitable, and also doesn't really reflect the reality of the migration history of Mississippi at all. Mississippi also has a new divisive concepts bill that's in place. And this attempts to restrict how university faculty can discuss race, among other things. So I don't have tenure. I just got tenure. I am careful in the ways I make really obvious connections to the present. But that is not to say that I don't work really, really hard to be able to give them the tools to do it themselves and to ask questions that allow them to make those connections with the present, and they often do. And the other kind of component of this is many of my white students are really uncomfortable talking about race. They've been raised with many of them, a kind of race blind, colorblind idea about race. And they also tend to think about race and racism. Racism is something just like people feel in their hearts. Like, do you hold negative views of people based on their race? Do you say mean things to them in public? Like, that is the kind of overarching conception of racism. And so over the semester, I work really hard to sort of shift our conversations about race to be about the structural ways that racial difference and racial inequality get produced through things like federal law. And federal immigration law is so great for this, because you can actually track over time how racial categories get created, get collapsed, get remade. And so just briefly, kind of early in the semester, we've done a week on Western conquest. We've thought about the West as this really diverse space. And then we learn about the Page Act and Asian exclusion. And I often show them a kind of primary source, right? The cartoon of the Chinese man as sort of small and delicate. There's like flames behind him. He's got a dagger between his teeth. He's holding a pistol. He's standing on top of a white woman who looks, dead or fainted. And we think about like what is happening with ideas about race and masculinity and sexuality in this trope. And then the next week, we think about how are tropes about sexuality and masculinity deployed against Black men, right? That they're also sort of sexually insatiable. And we think about how important this rhetoric was at the time for the federal government to justify denying some people citizenship, and as well as the kind of rights and protections of citizenship. We look at the 1924 Immigration Act, the quota system, the kind of eugenic ideas on which they're built. So those charts, those kind of eugenic charts we all know that sort of show like Norwegians are the least likely to be thieves and Sicilians are the most likely to be thieves. And we talk really openly about how these kind of gradations of whiteness, right? My students realize like they don't make any sense to them now, right? But those gradations people took really seriously and they really shaped federal immigration law. They shaped quotas. And so we talk about who gets portrayed as a criminal by virtue of their ethnicity, their natural origin, their race. And I pull these threads through, right? I take us back to the Page Act, thinking about Japanese internment. What does it mean that for people of a certain national background and of certain racial and ethnic identities, citizenship is always precarious, right? Even for those born in the US, right? That's a question then, but that is absolutely a crucial question right now. So for me, the Page Act is this really helpful jumping off point that allows me to kind of give students, I think, really crucial tools to talk about these concepts of race and citizenship, right? This is part of the critical thinking apparatus that I want students to get from a survey history class that they can hopefully take with them into their lives. And when they see the text of bills that these kind of divisive concept bills, they can look at that critically too.
Well, I just finished my. we have 3 weeks left, and I rushed here and canceled my office hours to do the event, which has been a real pleasure. But I think about teaching these, and especially in my big survey classes, I teach these questions comparatively. I discussed Reconstruction. Somebody else mentioned this before, but I have taught for a number of years Reconstruction. In sort of a 3-lecture day sequence. So like a week and a half, because I teach the second half of the survey, we start with Reconstruction and I introduce it as a national rather than a regional process, as a debate about the meaning of freedom in post-Civil War America, not as an issue of where do Black freed people fit into the post-war South. And so the first lecture day and discussion day, we talk about Black freed people in the South, but then I talk about the industrializing North and the new questions of labor. And then finally in the West, which is I think my favorite day because of what I research, we talk about race making, free labor, and rights in a comparative way. And usually I start with the 1852 People v. Hall case in California, in which Chinese testimony is said not to be admissible in court against whites. I move on through the 14th Amendment, its relationship to the Chinese and other people of color, and the diversity of the Western states and territories, and then on to the Page Act, exclusion, and Wong Kim Ark. Because I think, in fact, the Western experience is such an interesting way to discuss the meaning of freedom in post-Civil War America and how it diverges based on who you are, as well as gender. Of course, like others, I teach elective courses, and they offer perhaps different, if not more, opportunities for this kind of discussion. When I've taught Asian American history in the past, I tend to use a lot of racially comparative primary source material. Plus, then we do a lot of discussions. I start with the Page Act in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the class, but then by the time we get to the post-World War II years, I do like to keep looping back into these common themes. You know, especially these things come up when we discuss wartime and post-war World War II and Cold War ideas about gender, nuclear family formation, masculinity, immigration, and the US empire in the post-war years. And my students, fortunately, they naturally make these connections to issues today, sometimes more naturally than I would like. You know, trying to drag them back from a presentist interpretation of everything can be a little frustrating, but I do really enjoy how they talk about the links between stereotypes embedded in the Page Act, and they talk about the Atlanta spa murders, using their knowledge and of stereotypes and the way they're built over time. And sort of thinking about this and how to teach this as well. I was thinking about Dr. Dhillon's discussion of the thinness of the archive about some of these issues. And I'm kind of a broken record in this, but I do feel like, especially for the experience of Chinese American communities in the United States, there are so many Chinese language sources that exist, at least starting in the early 20th and often in the late 19th century. And they grow the archive naturally. And I think one of my sort of my broken record tendencies is to remind people the fact that you can't access the sources doesn't mean they're not there. And I don't mean this for Dr. Dhillon at all, but I mean this is something I've sort of pushed a lot in my previous work, that I think that these sources, when we can access them, they give voice to people who are too often claimed to not have left any record. The record is there, and it's often quite different from what we have in the immigration sources, almost, you know, as a rebuttal to those immigration sources. So in my own classes, in the past I've translated particularly good, interesting rebuttals to sort of place side by side with the official immigration records or newspaper articles or magazines. And this does prompt my students to discuss them in different ways that have often been eye-opening in the way that I eventually read those sources myself.
I think my co-panelists have talked a lot about the different ways in which you can teach the Page Act, and some of my methods are actually very similar. So perhaps I'll take another angle and just add a tiny bit to the conversation, which is I do teach a seminar course, a longer seminar course every week, 3 hours, on women in the family. And in that course, I like to think about the way in which women as a category is constructed, its intersection with other kinds of categories, whether it's race, labor, culture, religion, law, what have you, to have the sort of intersectional approach, but also introduce different kinds of historical actors that I think sometimes go missing in the canonical narratives that we might know due to public history or from other sorts of US history courses. So in teaching the Page Act in the seminar, I teach it alongside the works of scholars like Nayan Shah, who have thought about the way in which it's in some of his work, it's not just legislators that are creating particular racial or gendered caricatures of women, but other women who are also participating in this process, and women who are entering the workforce as state actors or municipal actors or local actors of various sorts, or through religious institutions, and their work is legitimized through the racialization or gendering of other women. And so to think about the fact that there is no singular sort of construction of women, and different women are on the scene when we're talking about the Page Act, and even the history after the Page Act when it relates to Chinese immigrant women and Chinese American women. I also like to think about the way in which analytically different groups weaponize conversations related to protecting women for certain kinds of legal or social or political ends. And I think kind of identifying in every historical moment who's doing what and for what ends is a critical analytical tool that students use to study history, but also to really think about the present. And I say that very seriously in a moment in which the safety of women is constantly being weaponized for certain kinds of legal and political ends, without allowing women, including the women whose safety that you're speaking in the name of, to have a voice in that conversation. The other thing I try to do is, like Professor Lou Williams, is introduce sources from communities that these individuals or women might be linked to, whether it's a larger immigrant community or a community of another sort, depending on the sort of social and kinship ties these women have. And I think it's very imperative to do that, because we often think that the relationship or the weaponization of women's issues happens in a sort of community state level, but it actually happens in many domains beyond that, which includes at a community level, right? Communities are not homogenous entities, and they have different sorts of forces. And when it comes to women's history, the issue of women's protection is also largely monopolized by men in these communities. And of course, men talk about women's issues in all sorts of ways, but there's a gendering that's very significant there that happens at that scale. And again, I can't emphasize enough that the history is important to root the contingencies that we're discussing, but I think the analytical skill sets that students develop by really looking at the more nuanced and nuanced narratives, but also the archival sources themselves, so that you're not just telling them history, you're actually like showing and sharing it, is a skill that I think is deeply needed, particularly in this moment of time. And really it does move beyond a specific time and place that you might be teaching about.
Thank you so much. So we have some questions from the audience. So I'd like to share those questions with you in the order that they come in. So just as a reminder, if you're audience and burning to ask questions for the panelists, please do so. This is your time to start to type in your questions in the Q&A sections. So the first question that we have is, do you think that the theory of state of exception can be used to explain the patterns of exclusion aimed at Chinese immigrants?
I mean, I guess I would direct this one to Hardeep, but if you don't want to do it, I can try.
Well, to be honest, when the question said state of exception, I wasn't exactly sure how the person who presented the question was using it. Is this like a Gumben's theory of state of exception, or is it like some other kind of no, I'm gonna kick it back to you and then I think
well, you know, I don't, so there's I guess there's some sort of rhetoric of emergency that often accompanies sort of the pushing of a nativist law. And often, you know, so if we talk in broadest terms, there's often, you know, back into sort of the justification of the 1882 Chinese Restriction Act, there was a description of Chinese immigrants as hordes or an alien invasion, right? There's a lot of this sense of like, in this emergency, we need to make exceptions to U.S. law. The actual way that the Supreme Court has approached these immigration laws, however, is not in this way, right? So instead, they, with the Chinese Exclusion Act cases, said that the power to exclude and then later to deport is an extra constitutional power, a plenary power based on U.S. sovereignty, as opposed to sort of something written in the Constitution. And so I think both these things are important to the law, but it's not directly relevant. But I think both give a sense of the degree of state power that's involved in immigrants' lives. That the sort of the rhetoric around emergency and also the sort of carving out of immigration law as distinct from criminal and civil law has all these ramifications for due process and the ability of immigrants to claim rights.
Yeah, I think that's right. I had to think a little bit about this and then also just remind myself what a government's state of exception is for a minute. And I think that there's questions in what Agamben posited about kind of the suspension of law and statelessness. But actually, when you look at history, in this historical moment, I don't think is necessarily true. I think what is more useful is to actually think about the very granular ways, as Dr. Lou Williams has just hinted, and even large scale ways in which law continues to be everywhere. And the hint to due process, this kind of scaling back of judicial review, I think that all of these things that are happening where law is completely part of the process, but we imagine that it isn't, is really significant. And in fact, I've actually been rethinking about this moment again and again in terms of conversations about judicial review that are happening now. You know, one of the points that Lucy Salyer makes in her book about this period is in some ways you do have a growing administrative state, but some courts are also removing their powers for judicial review. And I think we can think about this history again in this moment where law actually isn't disappearing. Various kinds of legal actors are actually participating in where we're placing it. And I think as historians, rather than thinking about just the big theories posited by Agamben and then picked up by others like Foucault, what might be helpful is to return to the historical contingency and the actual placement of law in these various moments and to think about their long legacy.
That's great. Thank you so much. Next question is there a scholarly consensus yet on whether the Chinese 6 companies in San Francisco was fighting against or complicit in the trafficking of Chinese women? Or was it both simultaneously or at different periods?
I was waiting for Charlotte or Professor Brooks to comment on this one.
I can try. I don't know if, I think one of the problems we have in accessing the Chinese 6 companies on records, I mean, those of us who have tried and failed, is that it's not like they maintain an easy archive, but I don't know if there's a scholarly consensus on it. I think there's an understanding. I mean, I'm thinking about actually in this case, the Chinese American press of the 30s, 40s, 50s, like the Chinese language press that discussed what was not a very far away history of women's immigration and of actually unlawful Piper Son immigration, discussing the understanding that, in fact, while there were not contracts for men per se, it was a situation of lending money and of indebtedness to particular companies or people. And I imagine that one of the problems is taking the Chinese 6 companies as sort of an organization that somehow ran Chinatown. I mean, these were different family and lineage groups and organizations that worked together to act as a spokesperson and defender for Chinese American community, but it wasn't a group with a particular set agenda. I imagine that there were people within that who did traffic and people who were more concerned about it and realized that it was undermining their attempts to basically argue that the Chinese were an economically beneficial and socially and culturally neutral or benign actors in the United States, such in California. So there's a series of memorials written to defend the Chinese American community in the 1870s. So I think it's difficult to sort of paint them as a homogeneous force. I'm sure there are people within who benefited from this, and especially who had connections with, some of the organizations that were involved in illegal activities as the amount of economic activities the Chinese could actually pursue shrank and shrank and shrank. But it's a difficult question because, again, I think those are actually archives that are pretty thin in part because they are pretty inaccessible, if in fact they do exist as archives, which I'm sure they are somewhere, and I dream of touching them and looking through them, but I don't think I'll ever manage that.
I am not a historian, a Nation American historian, but I think I can bring some insight from some really exciting scholarship on trafficking, history of trafficking and the construction of trafficking. I'm thinking about the work of Elisa Camasholi on French migrants to the United States, for example. And what at least scholars of sexual commercial sex and trafficking tend to come down on is that like were they trafficked or not question is actually sort of obscures some things. And the better question is to see labor and migration on this continuum, and to think about the real specific ways women's lives and choices and migrations and labors were constrained, not just in sex work, but much more broadly across the kind of fields of labor available to them, across the kind of family roles available to them. So trying to draw this bigger, more complicated picture that, again, that thinks about sexual labor as a form, just another form of labor that can be violent in all kinds of ways, that can be coerced in all kinds of ways, that can be chosen in all kinds of ways, often simultaneously.
Beth, did you want to add to that, or are you good to go? Okay, thank you. So we do have a few more questions, so hoping that we can get through them. But thank you so much for this webinar. And since there were discussions about US survey course lesson plans, I wanted to ask this. What are some crucial broader messages about 1, state government, and 2, federal government that you include with 1875 Page Act? And is there other acts that came before 1875 that you like to include in US survey course?
I'll answer quickly the second question, right? So are there other acts that I would include if I was teaching a US survey course before 1875? I think there's 2 other federal laws that I would highlight that also are really key, I think, if we're trying to trace a longer immigration history pre-1882. And one is an 1802 law that regulates, the federal government says that it will help to enforce southern states that are not allowing free Black people to enter, right? So it's essentially federal government involved in the regulation of the movement of free Black people. And I think that that law, which is not often cited, is important because it is an earlier example of immigration regulation based on race that is not linked to Chinese American history. And so is not often cited. I think the other common one that is cited before this is I think it's usually shortened to the Cooley Act that regulates where the United States, in the midst of the Civil War, attempted to regulate the movement of Chinese into Cuba. So it's not regulating into the United States, but into Cuba.
I'd like to add to what Professor Lou Williams, Dr. Lou Williams has just noted. I think there are several state, local, and federal laws that are being implemented at this time. And I think Dr. Lou Williams's comment about the regulation of free Black migrants and immigrants and the way that historian Michael Schwapner, I don't know if that's how you pronounce his last name, I've heard it in different ways. So if he's on the call, apologies, has traced where I think there are real questions among historians about thinking about the way in which the restrictions and regulation of immigrant communities, which includes Chinese immigrants in the 19th century, is actually tied to state laws regulating the movement of other kinds of communities. And Dr. Lou Williams just talked about the way in which free Black individuals who were traveling across state lines, but also into the United States, were a major concern in that way. And historians are tracing the connections. I also like to think about and I mentioned this earlier about the Page Act and Chinese restriction and exclusion with the changes in constitutional law that are happening in the wake of the Civil War. So to think about larger questions of legal rights and legal status and representation, and the way in which access to things like citizenship can protect people not only from being deported, but also having power at the polls, right? Real electoral power that has the ability to shape at least local legislation and potentially in the long run over years, law beyond the local level as well. And I think it really comes down to what about state development are you emphasizing? Is it a question about legal status? Is it a question about the regulation of people who are moving? And I think then the question becomes, which laws can you underscore in class that might allow you to highlight some of the connections?
Thank you. So I think I have time for a couple more questions, which is exactly what we have in Q&A. So thank you for such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. Building on your insights into how the Page Act crystallized racialized and gendered exclusion, I wonder how our narratives might shift if we center the role of knowledge producers, such as journalists, print culture, cultural intermediaries, not just as reflectors, but as key architects of exclusion. And the comment talks about how this, a person who asked the question has been working on the impact of religion, and just come across over and over again how discussions of immoral immigrants' bodies circulated through moralizing media long before beyond formal policy, and how central these discourses were to the passage of the Page Act and beyond. And as Professor Payne mentioned today, these logics weren't just legal, they were cultural, affective, and widely shaped. So how might taking these producers of racial knowledge more seriously reshape how we locate power in the history of immigration control?
I might throw a bit of a curveball and say that I think one of the less appreciated aspects of religion and exclusion is the frustration of missionaries, white missionaries, American missionaries trying to evangelize the Chinese population in China that did not really take kindly to their intervention and interference. And that one of the sources of a lot of anti-Chinese tropes in the United States were missionary journals. And we think of missionaries in the turn of the century and afterwards as advocating for Chinese Americans and sort of making a case for their human, their humanity and their and allowing them to come to the United States in some numbers. But in the 19th century, there was that, and there was also sort of frustration at the heathen, at the immoral heathen who desperately needed American Christians to transform them, but somehow didn't seem to get the fact that they needed this and were resistant, sometimes violent. And so those journals, although often circulated outside of what you might consider the mainstream, and I think we think of the Hearst Press or others who just made so much of the supposed that the Chinese posed, but then there was this sort of whole other set of really influential journals from people who supposedly knew because they were living in China and they were trying to evangelize.
In my work, I see social reformers, and particularly kind of drawing on Dr. Dhillon, women social reformers taking up these or helping to kind of perpetuate narratives that these kinds of immigration exclusions were a form of protection, not just of people in the United States and of white women in the United States from kind of foreign incursion, but also a means of protecting immigrant women themselves. So, for example, in some of my work, I look at how Kate Waller-Barrett, who's a sort of social reformer, runs these mission homes for pregnant women, evangelical Christian, really helps sell the idea popularly to the public that deporting prostitutes is a way of rescuing and saving them as long as white American women can help in the process and get appointed to roles in the Immigration Bureau to help carry it out. So again, it helps shift it doesn't necessarily cause the laws, but it shifts the narrative around them in really powerful ways.
Can
Thank you.
add,
Yes,
I
please.
guess, like, I absolutely agree that moralizing discourses about immoral folks have exclusionary ends, but in this moment, I've also been thinking about the way in which moralizing discourses about immoral people provide possibilities of inclusion, and I'm not condoning these kinds of moralizing narratives. I'll give you a clear example of this. For example, when Californian state legislators moved to exclude children of Chinese ancestry from the right to a public education, it's actually missionary groups on the ground that have these ideas of immoral children and criminality that are advocating for the reopening of the right to public education in the schoolhouse. And so I think what's really useful is to kind of pin the end product of what these discourses are designed to do. And of course, there's a racial kind of caricature and stereotyping that happens, which I'm, again, not condoning in any way, but it is to say that not all moralizing literature about immoral folks necessarily tends towards exclusion. There are possibilities in which it leads to these other kinds of end goals. And yes, that's not the discourse and the rhetoric that we may prefer people talking about other people in, but I just want to pinpoint that that is a historical and current day reality.
Thank you. We actually have a couple more questions. We obviously don't have a time to cover both of them thoroughly, but let me just quickly mention both of them so that if anybody has a very quick response to either one of them, then feel free to jump in. If not, that's perfectly fine. If someone mentioned, the first question mentions, the second founding of the United States, could anyone expand on this framing? And what this history of Chinese American history teaches us about this second founding. And then the last question is, how do you see the Page Act and debate surrounding it as affecting ideas about masculinity and femininity? So again, our time is very limited, but if you have just a very short answer to either one of those two questions, we would love to hear.
Those are really big questions. I'll just say a really fast thing on the second founding of the United States. I think this is referring to the constitutional revolution that comes with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. This really is a revolution, and it's a revolution that the Chinese immigrants are so central to, right? And we see this in the decades afterwards in Supreme Court cases. So Chinese are central to defining birthright citizenship. They're central to defining what is going to be equal protection. And then my first book talks about, although we focused a lot about how this, second founding is about defining citizenship, I also think that there's a lot of work being done at this time where the U.S. is starting to define what is alienage, what are non-citizens, and what are their rights.
Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time, so I apologize for people who posted more questions to Q&As, but we didn't have a chance to respond to it. Just want to quickly mention that the recording of this event will be posted as well as a transcript. So if you go to the website of the website that's posted on the chat section, that should be available to everybody. In a few days, it should be available there. So thank you everybody for participating in and generating this very informative, thought-provoking conversation tonight, and also everybody for participating in the webinar. Have a great evening.